Hello, my name is Nicolas Vecoven, and I will talk to you about our paper which is called Nets versus Trees for Feature Ranking and Gene Network Inference. So, we will start by the problem definition, explaining what we want to do. Then we'll go with the techniques that we use for artificial neural networks. We will show the results on artificial datasets. Then on a real dataset, which is the HIV dataset, and then we'll talk about gene network inference. In your typical machine learning problem, the goal is to achieve the best predictive performance based on the datasets. For this matter, ANN have proved to be very effective in the past few years, achieving extremely good predictive performances. However, there also exist many problems where one is more interested to understand what is the underlying process behind the dataset or behind the problem that you have. One way to gain interpretability is to compute feature importance scores. Techniques have been developed to try this with artificial neural networks. However, they were not generic and were mostly developed in the context of computer vision or text mining applications. It was also unclear how these techniques can perform on datasets where there are many irrelevant variables. And there's very few work that focused on deriving global importance scores from artificial neural networks, meaning that the measures developed until now were mostly local. So they were trying to see how relevant is a variable to predict the output of a given sample, whereas a global measure would look at how relevant a variable is for the entire dataset. So our goal is to address some of those issues with feature selection in deep neural networks and try to analyze their performances for feature selection on globally relevant variables and also on datasets with many irrelevant variables. As a quick definition, a variable is said to be relevant if it gives information about the output in isolation or in conjunction with any other subset of variables. To achieve feature selection, we use a method that's called feature ranking, and we define this as a procedure that exploits a dataset, so of, let's say, n input-output pairs, to associate an importance score to each input variable, xy. And the goal is to assign the highest scores to the relevant variables. We note, and it's important, that our goal is to rank all the relevant variables above the irrelevant ones, but we do not in any case evaluate the ranking of the relevant variables among them. Let us now talk about how we can associate a score to an input with artificial neural networks. There exists different types of methods to exert feature ranking with machine learning models, but we choose to focus on embedded approach. So this means that the feature selection is actually incorporated in the training of the model. Basically, we train the model and then we use the parameters that were learned by the model to compute importance scores based on a formula. For artificial neural networks, this can be broadly divided in two families. First, gradient-based approach, which basically compute the gradient of the output with respect to the input, and decomposition-based approach. So those are more varied and are basically about computing the importance for a given layer and then propagating some importance measure back to the input layer. It's a kind of modified backprop, if you will. So we will now explain one method of each of those families and then analyze it. And then after that, we'll show another method which is a bit different as it modifies the architecture of the neural network. The gradient method is actually quite easy and easily understandable, as the goal is to compute the derivative of the output of the neural network with respect to an input variable. So this basically gives you how much the output varies for a little variation of that input variable. If it varies widely, then of course the variable is supposed to be relevant, and if it doesn't, then it is supposed to be irrelevant. So you'll note that the derivative, of course, is computed for a given sample. So what we do want to do is obtain a global importance scores. To this end, we will basically only sum those importance, or I mean the absolute value of those importances, over all the instances of the training set. Doing this, it will result in a global importance score that we can use to find globally relevant variables. The layer-wise relevance propagation metric is a bit more complicated. So basically what you need to understand is that this method assigns an importance to each neuron in the neural network. We start by assigning the importance of the neurons in the final layer. They are basically associated in importance, which is to how much they contribute to the output. Once this is done, we can compute the importances of the neuron on the previous layer. This is done using the formula you see here on the slide, but this is just basically how can we split the importance of the next layer neurons to the previous layer. So, for example, if a neuron has a big influence on an important neuron of the next layer, then that neuron would also be very important. On the contrary, if a neuron doesn't contribute to any of the next layer's neurons or contributes very little, then that neuron is given a lower importance. You can then backpropagate this rule until you get to the first layer of the network, which is the input layer, and then you end up with your importance scores. As for the gradient method, you will note that this is basically computed for a given sample, and as for the gradient method, we sum this over all the samples in the training set, and this gives us our global importance score. The final method is a bit different in that it requires a specific architecture with a one-to-one connected layer. So this layer is only there to be regularized, meaning that you penalize the network for having big weights on the one-to-one layer. This is done by modifying the loss and by adding a regularization term to the standard loss that you use to train your neural network. So we know that you can use L1 or L2 regularization. So this is the formula that you see on the slide. However, we limit ourselves to the L1 regularization in the context of this talk, but you can see the paper for more details on why. The idea behind this regularization is that if the weights are too small, then information doesn't pass. So the network has to learn how to balance between having big weights for relevant features and having small weights for irrelevant features. So you can basically compute the importance by taking the absolute value of the weight. Finally, we also note that this method can be used in conjunction with the gradient and LRP methods. So our test setting is that we compare artificial neural networks with random forests on simulated datasets with a known ground truth. The variable ranking will be assessed using the area under the precision recall curve, and for the experiments that we will see, we use a fixed neural network architecture. So we tackle 4 artificial benchmarks, 2 linear, 1 classification, 1 regression, and 2 nonlinear, 1 classification and 1 regression also. One of the main things that you can see is that artificial neural network outperform random forest on linear datasets, but are outperformed by them on nonlinear ones. Also, we show that for these datasets at least, the gradient method coupled with the selection layer works best. Another interesting observation is that despite having way worse performances for feature selection on the nonlinear problems, artificial neural networks still greatly outperform random forests on a predictive performance basis. It is very important to note also the impact of the selection layer, which, as you can see here, is absolutely mandatory to achieve decent performances once the number of irrelevant features becomes too high. So you can see here that on a benchmark where there are 25 irrelevant features, then basically the methods without selection layer work quite well. However, on a benchmark where there are 9,900 more irrelevant variables, then in that case you can see that the performance of the neural networks without selection layer is way worse, be it in terms of error rate or in terms of AUPR, is way worse than with the selection layer. So has been shown to be quite important to have a selection layer. On the other hand, of course, the architecture in neural networks is very important, and here it is also the case that it is very important. As you can see, if you have too little or too much layers, so if your network is too shallow or too deep, then performances are pretty bad. You need to find that sweet spot in the middle. Furthermore, this figure also shows that using the error rate as a proxy for tuning parameters to have the best AUPR possible is decent, but it's not perfect, because as you can see, the best AUPR doesn't match the best error rate. So what about a real dataset? The goal of this dataset is to compute drug resistance with respect to some mutations. So in input you have HIV mutations, and in output you have the drug resistance, and we want to know which mutations are responsible for the drug resistance. So just to give some notions, there are 16 datasets, and there are between 600 and 800 samples per dataset, and there are between 200 and 300 mutations per dataset. Overall, results are more mixed than with the artificial datasets. So we can see that neural networks are, let's say, competitive with random forests, and that the selection layer is still important, but we can see that the measures are more mixed in terms of which one is better. So let us now talk about gene network inference. So the goal of this problem is to reconstruct a gene network from gene expression data. So given a network of genes, we want to find which genes regulate which genes in the network. We can achieve this through feature selection. So the method is basically, we isolate a gene and we want to predict that gene expression by using the expression of the other genes. And then we can select features from that model, and then the genes that have a high importance are supposed to regulate that particular gene that we isolated. Then we can repeat this for each gene, and then from all the importances that we were going to have, you can merge that, and this gives you a global interaction ranking in between all the genes. Then we can select all the highest interaction, and those are the link in our graph. Note that this framework is very general, and as you can see on the picture here, it can work with random forests, but in our particular case, we use it with artificial neural networks and compare it to that same framework but with random forests. So the first problem we tackle is a simulated problem with known ground truth, in which there are 100 genes and 100 samples. And so for this problem, random forests outperform artificial neural networks, and we have found that the architecture and the regularization parameter of the artificial neural network was very important to achieve decent performances. So this is a tough problem for artificial neural networks, as there are so little samples and they are known to be quite data hungry to perform well. So results were actually quite decent considering the setting. The next problem was to reconstruct the E-Colline network, which is a real dataset with unknown ground truth. So we assess our results with what is supposed to be the real network, as E. coli is a well-known bacteria, and so specialists have given what they think is the real network. So this is our ground truth. And so for this dataset, there are around 4,000 genes and 800 samples. And so, as we can see, basically the best method with artificial neural networks, which is gradient and selection layer, is basically completely equivalent to the random forest one. So we were competitive on this end. So as a conclusion, with our comparison between artificial neural networks and random forests, we show that the introduction of a selection layer is very beneficial in cases where there are many irrelevant variables, and it could even be used to achieve better predictive performances. Also, we show that despite better predictive performances, artificial neural networks are still outperformed by random forest on most tasks in terms of feature ranking. So this basically suggests that maybe better feature selection methods could be thought of with ANN. And so future work would include the analysis of other new importance scores measured with artificial neural network, and also a better characterization of these scores. Thank you for listening.